Christmas Eve. Little girl begged the Mafia boss to borrow a tree for her mom. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the Denver sky, dusting the sidewalks where holiday shoppers hurried past with bags and wrapped boxes, their breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. Outside the glass tower on 16th Street, workers in company uniforms dismantled the massive lobby Christmas tree, its ornaments already packed away in labeled boxes. The building rose 30 stories above the retail district, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces that caught the city lights and threw them back harder. A small hand pressed against the cold glass door, leaving a print that fogged and faded. Cora stood on tiptoes, her yellow knit cap sliding forward over her eyes as she craned her neck to see the tree being taken apart piece by piece. Her teddy bear dangled from one hand, its fur worn thin in places where she'd held it too tight during nights when her mom came home too tired to read stories. The glow from inside the lobby made her cheeks look even pinker from the cold. She pressed closer to the glass, watching each ornament disappear into foam-lined boxes with the fascination of someone witnessing magic in reverse. Caspian DeMarco emerged from the elevator wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his expression carved from the same stone as the building's foundation. His driver waited at the curb with the engine running, exhaust rising in white plumes. 2 security guards flanked him automatically, trained to scan for threats in crowds and doorways. He noticed the child only because she stood directly in his path, small and utterly unconcerned with the adult world's invisible hierarchies. She looked up at him with eyes that held no recognition of who he was or what his name meant in certain circles. "Can I borrow that Christmas tree?" Her voice carried the simple certainty of someone who'd never learned that some questions weren't supposed to be asked. "Just for my mom. She works at night and hasn't seen any decorations this year." The words tumbled out without rehearsal or manipulation, pure request without angle. Caspian's first instinct was the refusal that had become automatic over 3 years of closing himself off from anything resembling sentiment or weakness. His security chief shifted position slightly, ready to remove the obstacle with professional efficiency that wouldn't harm but would definitely relocate. The driver checked his watch because the schedule allowed no interruptions. Something in the child's face, the way she waited for an answer with complete faith that one would come, made Caspian hesitate in a way he hadn't since Isabella's funeral. The tree was already dismantled, scheduled for storage in some warehouse where next year's decorations waited in climate-controlled darkness. He'd walked past it every day for weeks without seeing it, the way he'd stopped seeing most things that reminded him of holidays he no longer celebrated. His penthouse 20 floors above held no decorations, no lights, no acknowledgement that December was different from any other month. The empty spaces had become comfortable, predictable, safe from the pain that came with remembering what Christmas used to mean. "My mom says asking isn't begging if you plan to give it back." Cora adjusted her grip on the teddy bear, its button eyes reflecting the lobby lights. She tried really hard to get decorations, but everything costs too much this year. The child's tone held no sadness, just factual reporting of circumstances beyond her control. "We have a corner where it would fit perfectly. I measured with my arms," she demonstrated, stretching her small limbs wide. Her mittens were mismatched, one red and one blue, probably from different sets lost to time and laundry. Something shifted behind Caspian's carefully maintained walls. Hairline fracture and foundation he'd thought was solid. He'd built an empire on knowing when people were running angles, reading manipulation in voice tones and body language. But this child operated in a register his defenses weren't designed to detect. His security team waited for the signal that would end this interaction and restore the schedule. The workers had paused mid-dismantle, ornaments half-packed and branches partially separated, waiting for direction that would tell them whether to continue or reverse course entirely. One of them checked his watch with the impatience of someone paid hourly who hadn't anticipated complications to a straightforward job. The lobby's warmth bled out through the open doors, mixing with December cold in a way that made the threshold uncomfortable for everyone standing in its draft. Caspian could feel his security chief's tension radiating outward. Professional concern about exposure time and vulnerability, trained instinct to keep his employer moving rather than stationary in public spaces where threats could materialize without warning. But Caspian remained planted, looking at this child who'd asked for something impossible and somehow made it feel reasonable, who'd turned a corporate lobby decoration into a family necessity through sheer conviction that borrowing was different from begging if you intended to return what you'd taken. Her logic was flawed in ways that didn't matter, built on a foundation of trust that the world would be fair if you were polite enough, that asking nicely would yield results because kindness should beget kindness. He'd spent 30 years learning that trust was currency for fools. that fairness was illusion perpetuated by people who'd never had to fight for anything. Yet here was a 5-year-old teaching him that maybe cynicism wasn't wisdom, just armor that had become too heavy to justify its protection. Give them the tree. His voice came out rougher than intended, command that surprised everyone, including himself. The entire thing, ornaments included. His security chief's eyebrow rose fractionally, the only visible sign of shock from a man trained never to question orders no matter how inexplicable. Deliver it to wherever she lives. The workers exchanged glances but began reversing their process, reassembling what they'd just taken apart. Cora's face transformed, smile breaking across features that suddenly looked less pinched by cold and circumstance. Really? You mean it? I promise we'll take good care of it and bring it back when Christmas is over. Her excitement manifested in small bounces that made her hat slip even further down. Thank you, mister. Thank you so much. She reached out and grabbed his hand with both of hers, mittens rough against his skin. The touch lasted only seconds before Cora released him and ran to where her mother had just appeared at the end of the block, shopping bag clutched tight. Caspian stood frozen on the sidewalk, feeling the ghost of that contact, the unself-conscious gratitude that expected nothing beyond what he'd already given. His driver opened the car door, but Caspian didn't move toward it, watching instead as a young woman in a sand-colored coat knelt down to listen to her daughter's breathless explanation. Even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion in the woman's posture, the way she held herself together through sheer will rather than actual strength. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail with strands escaping around her face. She looked toward the building, toward Caspian, and he saw the mortification wash across her features as she realized what her daughter had done. She stood quickly, taking Cora's hand and starting to walk away fast. Wait. The word came out before Caspian fully processed the decision to speak. He closed the distance between them in several long strides, his security team following automatically. The woman stopped but didn't turn around immediately, shoulders tense with embarrassment that radiated outward. I already told them to deliver it. His voice was softer now, less command and more something he couldn't quite name. You'd be doing me a favor, actually. It was just going into storage anyway. The lie felt necessary, a bridge over the chasm between their worlds. The woman turned slowly, and Caspian saw her face clearly for the first time under the street lamp. She was young, probably mid-20s, with eyes that held a strength that exhaustion couldn't fully dim. I'm sorry. My daughter shouldn't have bothered you. We don't need charity. Her tone was polite but firm, dignity wrapped tight around pride that wouldn't bend easily. It's not charity. It's a loan, like she said. Caspian found himself negotiating when he should have simply walked away, let his security handle the situation, restored the walls that were developing new cracks with each passing moment. The tree needs somewhere to go, and storage fees are actually significant for something that size. You'd be saving me money. The fabrication came easily, but felt wrong in a way his usual business lies never did. The delivery truck arrived at Riverside Apartments 53 minutes later, 2 workers carrying the tree up narrow stairs while Caspian's driver coordinated from the building's entrance below. Caspian sat in his car 2 blocks away with the engine idling, telling himself he was simply ensuring proper execution of orders. The neighborhood was older, buildings from the 70s that wore their age in peeling paint and patched concrete. Street lamps flickered with bulbs that needed replacing, casting uneven light across sidewalks buckled by tree roots and freeze-thaw cycles. He watched his phone track the delivery team's progress through an app designed for logistics management across his various business interests. The screen showed 2 blue dots moving through the building's outline, uploaded from property records his tech team accessed in minutes. Caspian had built legitimate companies alongside his family's traditional operations, real estate and security firms that generated legal profits and employed hundreds who never questioned where the DeMarco money originated. This particular building wasn't his. Belonged to some corporate entity that collected rent and ignored maintenance requests. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror but said nothing, trained to accept whatever unusual behavior his employer exhibited. The engine's idle was nearly silent, German engineering that cost more than some people earned in years, creating cocoon of climate-controlled comfort, while outside temperatures dropped towards single digits. Caspian's breath didn't fog the windows, because the car's systems prevented such inconveniences, maintaining perfect environment regardless of external conditions. He'd purchased this vehicle specifically for its ability to insulate him from the world, bulletproof glass and reinforced frame that made it mobile fortress against threats both physical and metaphorical. Now he sat in that fortress watching a building where people lived without such protections, where winter came through cracks around windows and heating bills had to be weighed against food budgets. The neighborhood's sounds filtered through even the expensive insulation, distant sirens and car alarms, someone's music playing too loud from an apartment with bass that rattled thin walls. A dog barked repeatedly, sound suggesting animal left alone too long in space too small, frustration manifesting in noise that annoyed neighbors who had no power to change the situation. This was the soundtrack of poverty, constant low-level stress that accumulated into health problems and shortened lifespans, environment that ground people down through relentless exposure to discomfort that money could eliminate, but its absence made inescapable. Caspian had grown up with silence. Homes where sound was controlled and unwanted noise simply didn't penetrate walls thick enough to protect against reality. The security chief had stayed at the tower to coordinate year-end operations, probably relieved to return to normal protocols after the sidewalk encounter's unexpected development. Caspian's phone buzzed with messages from his cousin about a New Year's business dinner, from his attorney about contract signatures, from his housekeeper confirming she'd prepared meals for the week. He ignored them all, eyes fixed on the blue dots that had stopped moving on his screen. The blue dots remained stationary, delivery complete, team heading back down to the truck. Caspian should have driven home to his penthouse, poured something expensive from the bar cart, stood at floor-to-ceiling windows watching Denver's lights spread toward the mountains. Instead, he found himself pulling forward, parking where shadows gathered between street lamps, watching as the delivery truck pulled away and lights came on in a second-floor window. Through thin curtains he could make out movement, shapes that resolved into the child dancing around something, arms raised in celebration visible even through the fabric barrier. The mother moved more slowly, placing ornaments with careful precision, each one handled like it mattered beyond its function. Their apartment couldn't be more than 800 square feet based on the building's layout, probably 2 bedrooms with a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. The tree would dominate whatever space they called a living room. Caspian had grown up in a mansion with rooms dedicated to purposes most people never needed, a ballroom his mother used twice a year, a library with first edition books no one read. His wife Isabella had loved the excess at first, the way money made everything possible. But toward the end, she'd talked about simplifying. She'd wanted to move somewhere smaller, focus on what mattered, instead of what impressed. He'd dismissed it as pregnancy hormones, assured her they'd discuss it after the baby came. But the baby never came, and neither did the future they'd imagined. The memory surfaced sharp and unwelcome, reminder of conversations he'd refused to have seriously until it was too late to have them at all. The apartment's lights glowed warmer now, the tree visible as a shape of color against the drab walls. Caspian couldn't see details from this distance, but his imagination filled them in anyway. Branches being fluffed, lights being tested, ornaments catching and throwing back illumination. He'd spent $45,000 on his penthouse's tree 3 years ago, designer hired to create something magazine-worthy. Every element had been coordinated to a theme Isabella approved before she got sick. He'd had it removed the day after her funeral, and hadn't put one up since. The empty corner in his living room where it had stood remained empty, furniture arranged to avoid acknowledging the absence. His mother had stopped asking why he didn't decorate, stopped inviting him to help with the family compound's elaborate displays. A figure appeared briefly at the window, curtain pulled aside by small hands that pressed against glass just like they'd pressed against his building's door. Cora's face emerged from darkness into view, looking down at the street below with wonder that suggested the tree had transformed not just a room, but an entire world. Her mother appeared behind her, gently pulling her away from the window, settling her down with what looked like hot chocolate. The domestic scene was so ordinary it hurt to watch, reminder of everything Caspian had built walls to avoid remembering. His phone buzzed again, his cousin asking if he'd be at the family compound for Christmas dinner like always, obligation disguised as invitation. The DeMarco clan gathered every year for traditions that felt more like business meetings with better food, everyone performing family while calculating advantage. Caspian had attended faithfully since Isabella died, because the alternative was admitting the day meant something worth avoiding. He texted back a confirmation, words without warmth, commitment made from habit rather than desire. The apartment's lights dimmed slowly, bedtime rituals happening in sequence, child finally settling while mother likely collapsed from exhaustion she'd been fighting all day. Caspian watched until all the lights went out except the tree's glow, rainbow of color bleeding through curtains into the December darkness. Only then did he put his car in gear. pulling away from a curb he had no logical reason to be parked at, driving toward a home that had never felt like one. His penthouse occupied the entire 30th floor, accessible only by private elevator that required keycard and code. The doors opened directly into his living space. 3,000 square feet of marble and glass and furniture, selected by designers who'd aimed for sophisticated modern with masculine undertones. Everything was exactly where he'd left it that morning, untouched and perfect and lifeless. The city sprawled below his windows, millions of lights representing millions of lives he'd never intersect with, separate and safe behind walls of wealth and deliberate isolation. He poured 2 fingers of scotch older than most of the people working in his buildings, then set the glass down without drinking. The corner where his Christmas tree had stood 3 years ago remained conspicuously empty, space defined by absence rather than presence. Isabella had loved that corner, said the windows behind it made the tree look like it was floating in the city lights. She'd planned to take a photo there with their baby. Caspian walked to the window instead, pressing his palm against glass cold enough to sting. Somewhere out there in the grid of streets and buildings, a little girl was probably asleep under a borrowed tree, her mother finally resting after another shift that paid too little for too much work. He'd given them something worth perhaps $8,000 in decorations and labor, amount that meant nothing in his accounts, but apparently everything in theirs. The transaction should have ended there, brief intersection of worlds that would never touch again. But Caspian found himself thinking about the mother's eyes, the way they'd held strength despite exhaustion, dignity despite circumstances that offered no room for either. She hadn't begged or manipulated, hadn't even accepted until her daughter's hope made refusal impossible. That kind of pride was rare in his world, where everyone wanted something, and most weren't subtle about taking it. Christmas came and went in a blur of obligation and alcohol, family dinner at the compound where his uncle discussed expansion opportunities and his cousins compared watches. Caspian performed his role adequately, enough presence to avoid questions, enough distance to prevent real connection. His mother kissed his cheek and told him he looked thin, concern that never translated into conversation about why he might not be eating well or sleeping through nights. He left before dessert, claiming early meetings that didn't exist, driving through streets emptied by holiday gatherings happening behind lit windows. The city felt abandoned in a way that usually brought relief, but tonight just emphasized the isolation he'd constructed so carefully. His penthouse waited with its expensive emptiness, silence broken only by the hum of climate control maintaining perfect temperature in rooms no one lived in, just existed through. December 27th brought snow that transformed Denver into something cleaner than it actually was, white covering the dirt and grime that accumulated in corners and alleys. Caspian's office occupied the 28th floor of his building, all windows and minimalist furniture, space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. His assistant brought coffee and the morning's correspondence, emails and contracts that required signatures and decisions. Halfway through the stack was an envelope that didn't belong, personal-sized and addressed in careful handwriting that belonged to someone who'd learned penmanship before school stopped teaching it. His assistant explained it had been delivered by hand to the lobby the previous day, left with security for him specifically. No return address marked the paper, just his name written with precision that suggested effort and care. Caspian opened it with the letter knife Isabella had given him for their first anniversary, silver with his initials engraved on the handle. Inside was a card made from construction paper, folded carefully, with a drawing that could only have come from a child's hand. Cora had drawn 3 figures under a decorated tree, stick people with circular heads and triangle dresses, smiles indicated by curved lines. One figure was tiny with yellow on its head, obviously the child herself. One was taller with long yellow lines for hair, the mother. The third figure was separate from the other 2, standing near but not quite with them, wearing what might have been a suit jacket rendered in black crayon. Above the drawing, in letters that mixed upper and lower case randomly, were the words, "Thank you for Christmas." Below the drawing, in different handwriting that matched the envelope, was a note that took up the bottom half of the card. "Thank you for your extraordinary kindness to my daughter and to our family. The tree has brought more joy than you could possibly know. Cora talks about the nice man who gave us Christmas, and I find myself at a loss for how to adequately express our gratitude. Please know that your generosity mattered." The note was signed simply, Caitlin. No last name, no phone number, no suggestion that this exchange should continue beyond its natural conclusion. The formality of the language suggested someone who'd learned to communicate carefully, weighing each word for multiple audiences the way people did when they dealt with caseworkers and creditors who looked for reasons to deny or demand. Yet beneath the careful construction was genuine warmth. Caspian read it 3 times, fingers tracing the places where Cora's crayon had pressed hard enough to leave texture on the paper. He'd received thousands of thank you notes over the years, professionally printed cards from business associates, effusive letters from charitable organizations acknowledging donations made primarily for tax purposes. None of them had been kept past the week they arrived, filed and forgotten as soon as his assistant logged them. This one he placed carefully in his desk drawer, smoothing out a crease in the corner where it had been folded. The drawing stared up at him before he closed the drawer. 3 figures under a tree, the separate one standing close enough to matter, but far enough to leave. Caspian couldn't remember the last time someone had drawn him, included him in a picture of family even though he wasn't family, would never be family to these strangers who'd briefly intersected his carefully controlled existence. His assistant knocked and entered with questions about a property acquisition, numbers and projections that required decisions. Caspian forced his attention back to business, the machinery of empire that continued regardless of personal disruption. But throughout the day his hand kept returning to the drawer, opening it to confirm the card was still there, that he hadn't imagined the whole interaction. By late afternoon he'd accomplished less than usual, distracted by thoughts that had no place in his professional sphere. The drawing bothered him, specifically the way Cora had placed him near but separate, instinctively understanding that he existed outside the warm circle of her family. Children were perceptive about these things, noticed the boundaries adults pretended didn't exist. She'd drawn truth without judgment. Caspian left the office earlier than normal, telling his assistant to reschedule his evening calls. The drive home took him past the Riverside apartments, not directly but close enough that a small detour was barely noticeable. He told himself he was simply checking different routes, exploring neighborhoods he might consider for property investment. The lie was unconvincing even to himself. The building looked worse in daylight, paint peeling more obviously, stairs showing concrete where the surface had crumbled away. Second-floor windows revealed curtains of varying quality, some professional and matched, others clearly makeshift solutions to privacy needs. Apartment 2B's window still glowed with Christmas lights, even at 4 in the afternoon, tree visible as a shape of color behind fabric that had been washed too many times. Caspian didn't stop, just slowed enough to see without being obvious about seeing. A woman emerged from the building's entrance carrying grocery bags, blonde hair pulled back, sand-colored coat wrapped tight against the cold. Caitlin walked with purpose despite visible exhaustion, each step deliberate, shoulders back in defiance of whatever weight she carried beyond the physical bags in her hands. She didn't look toward his car, had no reason to notice one expensive vehicle among the many that used this street as a shortcut. Caspian watched in his rearview mirror as she climbed the exterior stairs, disappearing into the building without pause or backward glance. Something about her bearing struck him as familiar, the way she held herself together through circumstances that should have broken her into asking for help. He'd seen it in his mother years ago, before his father's business interests had generated enough legitimate income to erase the constant worry about money. That particular form of pride came from having nothing left to lose except dignity, holding on to it with both hands because surrendering it meant admitting defeat. Caitlin carried it like armor that protected nothing but made the carrying feel like resistance. The light changed and traffic flowed forward, carrying Caspian away from the building and the woman and the questions forming in his mind about what happened to people who asked for nothing and received even less. His penthouse waited with its climate-controlled air and its empty corners, space designed for a family that would never fill it. The card in his desk drawer felt heavier than paper should. January arrived with cold that turned breath to ice and made every surface treacherous with frost that refused to melt even at noon. Caspian spent New Year's Eve alone in his penthouse, watching fireworks bloom over the city while nursing scotch that tasted like nothing. His phone buzzed with invitations to parties where people would pretend to enjoy each other's company, while calculating who could be useful in the coming year. He ignored them all, preferring honest isolation to performed connection. The card remained in his desk drawer at the office, taken out and studied during moments when he should have been focusing on quarterly reports or expansion strategies. Cora's drawing had captured something he couldn't articulate, the 3 figures under the tree representing a completeness his life lacked despite having everything money could purchase. The separate figure standing near but not with them felt like prophecy or diagnosis, observation that cut deeper the more he considered it. On January 7th, a Tuesday with no particular significance, Caspian found himself driving past Riverside Apartments again during what should have been his lunch hour. The tree's lights were still visible in the second-floor window, though the holiday was long past, and most of the city had packed away decorations with relief or regret. The persistence of those lights bothered him in ways he couldn't explain, suggesting either inability to let go or determination to hold on to joy regardless of calendar expectations. His phone rang with his cousin's name on the screen, probably calling about the business dinner he'd confirmed, and then avoided through a last-minute excuse about flu. Caspian let it go to voicemail, pulling into a parking spot with a view of the building's entrance. He told himself he was taking a break from the office, clearing his head before afternoon meetings. The rationalization felt thin even as he constructed it. 20 minutes passed with nothing happening except people coming and going from the building, none of them the blonde woman or her daughter. A man in a maintenance uniform carried a toolbox up the exterior stairs, disappearing into the building's dim interior. An elderly woman descended slowly, gripping the railing with both hands, while a younger woman walked beside her, providing steadying presence without actually touching. Life happening in small increments, unremarkable and essential. Caspian was about to leave when the second-floor apartment door opened, and Caitlin emerged carrying a bag of trash toward the dumpster enclosure at the building's side. She wore the same sand-colored coat, hair pulled back, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for tasks that mattered more than garbage disposal. He watched her walk across the parking lot, shoulders hunched against wind that cut through fabric too thin for Colorado winter. She was halfway back to the building when it happened. One moment she was walking normally. The next, her hand shot out to grip a parked car's hood, body folding forward as breath came too fast and harsh. Even from a distance, Caspian could see the way her chest heaved, the panic that crossed her face as she struggled for air that wouldn't come. Her free hand pressed against her sternum, fingers splayed wide like she could somehow force her lungs to cooperate through pressure alone. Caspian was out of his car and moving before conscious decision caught up with action. He covered the distance in seconds, arriving as Caitlin's knees started to buckle despite her grip on the car. Her face had gone pale, lips taking on a bluish tinge that triggered alarm even without medical training. She tried to speak but only managed a gasping sound that held frustration and fear in equal measure. Easy. His hands caught her elbows, supporting weight she could no longer hold independently. "I've got you." Her eyes focused on him with recognition that came too slow, brain struggling with oxygen deprivation. "Where's your apartment? Can you walk?" She nodded once, jerky movement that took effort, and let him guide her toward the building while her breathing remained labored and shallow, each inhale sounding like it scraped against something broken inside. They made it up the exterior stairs through sheer determination, Caitlin leaning heavily on the railing while Caspian's hand stayed at her back, ready to catch her if she fell. The interior hallway smelled like cooking oil and mildew, fluorescent lights flickering with electrical issues no landlord cared enough to fix. Apartment 2B's door was unlocked, opening into a space that was small but meticulously clean. Everything in its place because there was barely room for anything at all. The Christmas tree dominated the living area just as Caspian had imagined, branches reaching toward a ceiling too close, ornaments reflecting light from windows that needed better insulation. Caitlin collapsed onto a worn couch that had clearly been purchased second-hand, maybe third-hand, fabric rubbed thin in places where bodies had sat for years. Her breathing was gradually slowing, but still came with visible effort, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that wasn't quite right. "Where's your daughter?" Caspian's question came out sharper than intended, looking around the apartment for signs of the child who should have been present during a weekday afternoon. "Daycare." Caitlin's voice was barely audible, scratchy and strained. "I pick her up at 4. She closed her eyes, hand still pressed to her chest. "I'm fine. Just need a minute." The lie was transparent, contradicted by every visible indicator of her physical state. "You need a doctor." Caspian pulled out his phone, already scrolling for the private clinic his family used for situations requiring discretion. "This isn't fine. This is a medical emergency." Caitlin's eyes opened, focusing on him with something between anger and desperation. "I can't afford emergency rooms." Her words came in fragments between breaths. "No insurance. The bills would destroy us. Please don't call an ambulance." The statement hung between them, exposing the brutal mathematics of American healthcare, where seeking help meant financial ruin for people operating without safety nets. Caspian had never considered what it meant to weigh dying against bankruptcy, to calculate whether suffering was cheaper than treatment. His family's doctor made house calls for hangnails, charged amounts that never appeared on any official record. The distance between their worlds suddenly felt wider than the few miles separating their addresses. I'm calling my doctor. Not an ambulance, not a hospital. Someone who'll come here and figure out what's wrong. Caspian's tone left no room for argument, even as Caitlin opened her mouth to protest. You can't pick up your daughter if you can't breathe. The logic was irrefutable, cutting through pride with practical necessity. She closed her mouth, nodded once, defeat and relief mixing in her expression as she surrendered to help. She'd spent years learning to refuse. Doctor. Chen arrived 40 minutes later with a medical bag and questions asked in a calm voice designed to soothe while gathering information. He'd been the DeMarco family physician for 20 years, understanding exactly what kinds of situations required both competence and complete discretion. Caspian waited in the kitchen area, which was barely large enough to qualify as a room, while the doctor examined Caitlin on the couch that doubled as her only seating. The kitchen told stories through its contents. Generic brand everything, portions calculated for maximum stretch. A calendar on the wall showed Caitlin's work schedule written in pencil that could be erased and rewritten as shifts changed. Bills were stacked on the counter in order of urgency, red notices on top. A ceramic jar labeled Cora's College held coins and a few dollar bills, dreams saved in increments that would never add up to actual tuition, but represented hope anyway. Caspian opened the refrigerator without thinking. Inventory automatic. Milk expiring tomorrow. Eggs, cheese, vegetables starting to wilt. Everything purchased for maximum nutrition at minimum cost. The freezer held single-serving meals, probably for nights when Caitlin worked late, and Cora needed something quick. No luxuries, no treats, no excess of any kind. He'd spent more on lunch yesterday than this family probably spent on groceries for a week. Dr. Chen emerged from the living area with an expression Caspian recognized from other serious conversations about health issues that required more than simple prescriptions. She has advanced chronic respiratory disease, probably from long-term chemical exposure. Her lungs are badly scarred. He pulled out a prescription pad, writing with quick efficiency. She needs these medications immediately, and she needs to stop doing any kind of physical labor. Her condition is degenerative. Without proper treatment and rest, she's looking at serious complications within months. How serious? Caspian kept his voice low, aware that Caitlin could probably hear them despite the thin wall separating kitchen from living area. Without intervention, she'll be on oxygen within 6 months, possibly deceased within 2 years. With proper care and the right medications, she can manage it, but she needs to eliminate all exposure to irritants and reduce physical stress significantly. Doctor. Chen's clinical tone didn't soften the brutality of the prognosis. Caspian looked toward the living area where Caitlin sat upright now, color returning slowly to her face. She was 26 according to Dr. Chen's questions, younger than Caspian by 4 years, with a 5-year-old daughter depending entirely on her survival. The math was simple and devastating. If she kept working the jobs available to someone without higher education or specialized skills, jobs that required physical labor and offered no health insurance, she'd be dead before Cora turned 8. The medications Dr. Chen prescribed cost $800 monthly without insurance. Caspian knew this because he asked directly, needing concrete numbers to understand the scope of impossible choices. Caitlin probably made that much in 2 weeks of work that was actively killing her. The spiral was perfect and inescapable. Poverty creating health problems that created more poverty until the system consumed people who'd never had a chance to escape it. He'd profited from this system. Owned properties rented to people exactly like her. Dr. Chen left prescriptions and instructions. His bill waved away with a gesture that meant Caspian would handle payment through the usual untraceable channels. Caitlin sat on the couch looking smaller than her actual size, hands folded in her lap, while processing information that had just rearranged her understanding of her future. The clock on the wall showed 3:15, 45 minutes before she needed to collect Cora from daycare that probably cost more than she could sustainably afford. You heard what he said. Caitlin's voice was steady despite circumstances that warranted falling apart. I can't afford those medications. I can't stop working. I have rent due in 2 weeks and daycare payments and utilities. Her tone was matter-of-fact, accountant tallying impossible numbers that wouldn't balance no matter how many times she recalculated. So I guess I keep going until I can't anymore. The resignation in her words hit harder than anger or tears would have. Caspian sat in the armchair across from her, furniture that didn't match the couch, but served its function adequately. What about family? Friends who could help? The question felt intrusive but necessary. mapping the support systems that should have existed but probably didn't. Caitlin's laugh was short and bitter, sound without humor. My parents died when I was 19. Cora's father left before she was born. I had friends once, but poverty makes people uncomfortable. They stopped calling after I couldn't afford to meet for coffee anymore. The isolation she described was familiar, despite their vastly different circumstances. Caspian's walls were built from choice and trauma, hers from necessity and abandonment. But the end result was the same. Two people existing in a city of millions with no one who'd notice if they stopped existing, except for the child who depended on Caitlin's continued survival. That dependency was the only thing keeping her from surrendering to the exhaustion that radiated from her, like heat from a stone that had absorbed too much sun. I worked as a house cleaner for 3 years before I got sick. Caitlin spoke to fill the silence, or maybe because diagnosis had broken something loose that needed to come out. 5 different services, sometimes 15 houses a week. The chemicals they used were industrial strength, no ventilation requirements, no protective equipment provided. I'd come home smelling like bleach and ammonia, coughing so hard I couldn't sleep. But it paid $9 an hour plus tips, and that was better than retail or food service. She'd been fired 3 years ago when the coughing became too disruptive. Managers concerned she'd alarm clients or spread illness despite her protestations that respiratory disease wasn't contagious. No unemployment because she'd been classified as an independent contractor, loophole that saved companies from paying benefits or accepting liability. She'd bounced between jobs since then, each one lasting until her health issues became too obvious to ignore, employers cutting her loose before she could establish any legal protections. Currently, she worked as an overnight caregiver for elderly clients, sitting with people who couldn't be left alone while their families slept. The work paid slightly better than cleaning had, and didn't require physical exertion beyond staying awake and alert for emergencies. But it meant Cora spent evenings with a neighbor who charged $20 a night, money that disappeared before Caitlin even saw her paycheck. The math of poverty allowed no accumulation, every dollar allocated before it arrived. Caspian listened without interrupting, building a picture of systematic failure that wasn't accidental but designed. The companies that hired Caitlin and workers like her profited from classification schemes that avoided responsibility, from wages kept deliberately low, from healthcare systems that priced treatment beyond reach. He owned similar companies, signed off on similar policies, trusted managers to handle details that resulted in exactly these outcomes. The connection between his wealth and her poverty wasn't abstract or theoretical. How long have you known about the respiratory disease? The question emerged quieter than he intended. Caitlin shrugged, gesture that tried for casual and missed. A year, maybe. Longer. I went to a free clinic once when the coughing got really bad. They told me I needed to see a specialist, get imaging done, probably needed medication. The imaging alone would have cost $2,000, so I just tried to manage it on my own. Managing it meant over-the-counter medications that barely touched the symptoms, meant working through attacks that should have sent her to emergency rooms, meant gambling that she'd survive long enough for Cora to reach an age where she could somehow manage alone if necessary. The calculations were impossible, and she'd been making them anyway, because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant her daughter would end up in a foster system that destroyed more children than it saved. Caspian thought about the $800 he'd spent on scotch the previous month, amount that could have covered Caitlin's medication, but had instead been consumed and forgotten. He thought about the $45,000 tree that had stood in his penthouse for 6 weeks before Isabella died, decorations purchased and discarded without thought. The numbers made him nauseous in a way that had nothing to do with physical illness, and everything to do with moral implications he'd spent years avoiding. The clock ticked toward 4, time running out for a pickup that couldn't be missed. Caitlin started to stand, movement slow and careful, testing her body's current capabilities. I need to get Cora. She can't be the last one there again. The shame in her voice suggested this had happened before. Child waiting with teachers who had other places to be. Mother's illness making her unreliable in ways that marked both of them. I'll drive you. Caspian was already standing, keys in hand before she could refuse. You're not walking 15 blocks in your condition, and you're certainly not taking the bus. His tone was firm, but not unkind. Statement of fact rather than negotiation. Caitlin looked like she wanted to argue, pride warring with practicality, but another deep breath that caught wrong somewhere in her lungs decided the matter. She nodded, reaching for her coat with movements that showed just how much the episode had cost her. The daycare was in a church basement 3 miles away, Fluorescent lit space with alphabet posters and tiny chairs where children were being collected by parents who arrived promptly at closing time. Cora was playing with blocks in the corner, one of only 3 children remaining, face lighting up when she saw her mother come through the door. "Mama!" She ran over, arms up for the hug that Caitlin provided despite how much the impact must have hurt her damaged chest. The teacher gave Caitlin a look that combined concern with the professional distance required by someone who saw too much struggle and couldn't fix any of it. "Everything okay? You sounded rough on the phone earlier." Caitlin had clearly called to warn she might be late, buying time during the episode that could have killed her. "Fine. Just a bad day. Thank you for staying." She signed the checkout sheet while Cora noticed Caspian standing by the door. "It's the tree man." Cora's voice carried across the room, drawing attention from the other parents and remaining children. "Did you come to see if we're taking good care of it?" "We are, I promise. We water it every day and turn the lights on every night." Her enthusiasm was infectious and slightly heartbreaking, the way she treasured something that had cost Caspian nothing but meant everything to her. Caitlin's cheeks flushed, embarrassment at her daughter's volume and the attention it attracted. Caspian knelt down to Cora's level, movement that made his expensive suit crease in ways his tailor would notice. "I'm glad you're enjoying it. I actually came to give your mom a ride home because it's very cold outside. Would that be okay with you?" Cora nodded vigorously, yellow hat bobbing. "Can we stop for hot chocolate?" Her question was automatic, child's understanding that rides sometimes came with treats attached. "Not today, sweetie." Caitlin's voice was gentle but firm. "Maybe another time." She took Cora's hand and headed for the door, moving faster than was probably wise given Dr. Chen's instructions. Caspian followed, noting how the teacher watched them leave with an expression that suggested she was building narratives about expensive suited men and struggling single mothers. The story she was probably constructing wasn't accurate, but Caspian understood why she'd default to those assumptions. The world taught people to expect predators, not random kindness. The drive back to Riverside Apartments was quiet, except for Cora's chatter about her day, preschool drama involving block towers and sharing disputes. Caitlin stared out the window, face unreadable, probably calculating how this interaction would be paid for, because nothing in her experience came without cost. Caspian wanted to tell her this wasn't transactional, but the words felt hollow, even unspoken. Everything was transactional in the worlds they came from, even if the currencies differed. He pulled up to the building's entrance, idling while Caitlin unbuckled Cora and gathered her things. "Thank you for the ride, and for calling your doctor. I'll figure out the payment plan." Her words were stiff with formal gratitude, distance reimposed after the vulnerability of her medical crisis. Caspian nodded, not trusting himself to respond in ways that wouldn't sound like pity or worse, like the beginning of expectations he wasn't ready to name. They walked toward the building, small figure and taller one, yellow hat bobbing beside sand-colored coat. Caspian waited until they disappeared inside before driving away, the image of them climbing those exterior stairs imprinted behind his eyes. His penthouse waited with its empty corners and expensive silence. The card in his desk drawer felt like a commitment he hadn't agreed to, but couldn't figure out how to refuse. 3 days passed before Caspian contacted Dr. Chen for a full report, using work as excuse for the delay, when really it was cowardice about confronting information he already knew would be bad. The doctor's assessment confirmed initial diagnosis and added complications. Caitlin's condition was worsening faster than typical progression suggested, possibly due to continued exposure to irritants or simply bad genetic luck. Without the prescribed medications and significant lifestyle changes, her prognosis measured in months rather than years. Caspian authorized payment for the prescriptions through a pharmacy that asked no questions about who was covering costs for patients who arrived without insurance or ability to pay. He had them delivered to Caitlin's apartment by courier. No note attached. No acknowledgement that would require response or create obligation. The gesture was cowardly, helping from a distance that protected him from gratitude or the messy reality of her situation. He told himself it was enough, that medication solved the problem, that his responsibility ended with prescription fulfillment. But his car kept finding reasons to drive past Riverside Apartments during times when he should have been in meetings, or managing the various business interests that required his attention. He never stopped, just slowed enough to see that the lights still glowed in the second-floor window, that life continued behind walls he had no legitimate reason to breach. The tree remained up past any reasonable timeline, ornaments visible even in daylight, stubborn refusal to let the season end. His cousin called about the missed dinner, voice sharp with annoyance that someone had violated family obligation without providing adequate excuse. Caspian let him vent, offering no explanation, because none existed that would satisfy a man who'd never had to choose between medication and rent. The DeMarco family operated on complex hierarchies of respect and appearance, disappointment in Caspian's recent absences, registering as potential weakness in the social structure. He didn't care enough to perform properly. Work became mechanical, decisions made from habit rather than engagement. His assistant noticed the distraction, gently suggesting he take a vacation, or at least a long weekend to reset. Caspian assured her he was fine, another lie in a growing collection, and pushed through meetings where he provided the minimum required presence. At night, his penthouse echoed with absence, Isabella's ghost joined by newer specters of a woman struggling to breathe, and a child who'd drawn him into her family with crayons and innocence. On January 23rd, 2 weeks after Dr. Chen's visit, Caspian returned to his office to find another envelope waiting on his desk. Same careful handwriting, same personal size that stood out among business correspondence. His assistant offered no explanation for its arrival, suggesting it had appeared through the same mysterious delivery system as the first. Caspian waited until she'd left before opening it, oddly reluctant to discover what new complication this would introduce. The card was simpler this time, store-bought rather than handmade, generic winter scene on the front with snowflakes and pine trees. Inside, Caitlin's handwriting covered both sides of the space, more words than the first note had contained. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. The medications arrived, and I know they didn't appear by magic. My pride wants to refuse them, to insist I can handle this myself, but I can't. I'm not handling it. So I'm setting aside pride long enough to say thank you, and to ask if there's any way I can repay you. I know it's not equivalent, but I could clean your apartment, or provide caregiving services, or something that makes this less like charity and more like an actual exchange. The offer of labor in exchange for medical care was so perfectly American, it made Caspian's chest tight. She'd been given the means to potentially survive, and her first instinct was to convert mercy into transaction, to restore the power imbalance through service that would probably damage her health further. The desperation behind the words was palpable. Woman raised to believe that accepting help meant accepting debt, that nothing came free except judgment. He pulled out paper from the drawer where Isabella's fountain pen still lived, expensive implement he'd bought her for Christmas 3 years ago that she'd never gotten to use. The ink flowed smooth and dark, his handwriting nowhere near as careful as Caitlin's, but legible enough. You don't owe me anything. Consider the medications handled. If you want to repay me, focus on getting better and taking care of your daughter. That's sufficient exchange. The words looked inadequate on paper, formal and dismissive when he meant them to be reassuring. He added another line. If you need anything else, you have my office address. Don't hesitate to reach out. Then he sealed the envelope and had his assistant arrange delivery. Same mysterious system in reverse. The exchange felt incomplete. Gesture that solved nothing while pretending to solve everything. But he didn't know what else to offer that wouldn't cross lines he wasn't ready to acknowledge existed. February brought cold that made January look mild, temperatures dropping below zero with wind chill that killed anyone stupid enough to stay outside too long. The city's homeless population shrank as people froze in alleys and parking garages, deaths that barely made the news, because poverty dying of cold wasn't remarkable enough for headlines. Caspian's building lobbies became impromptu shelters until security cleared them, people seeking warmth wherever glass doors could be briefly breached. He implemented a policy change without consulting his management team, instructing security to allow lobby access during extreme cold warnings, as long as visitors didn't disrupt business or sleep in common areas. The decision generated pushback from executives who worried about liability and image concerns, arguments Caspian overruled with authority that didn't welcome debate. If anyone asked, he claimed it was risk mitigation rather than human decency, protecting the company from bad publicity if someone froze on their doorstep. The lie satisfied corporate logic. Caitlin didn't write again, and Caspian didn't seek her out, both maintaining the careful distance that allowed them to pretend the intersection of their lives had been temporary rather than ongoing. He told himself this was appropriate, that further contact would create complications neither needed. But he found himself looking for her in crowds downtown, scanning faces for blonde hair and sand-colored coats, preparing responses to encounters that never materialized. On Valentine's Day, a holiday Caspian had ignored since Isabella died, He found himself in the greeting card aisle of a drugstore he had no reason to visit. The children's section caught his attention. Cards with cartoons and glitter that Cora would probably love. He almost bought one. Got as far as the checkout line before recognizing how crossing this boundary would change everything. He put it back and left the store empty-handed, feeling like he'd failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. That night, his penthouse felt especially empty, the silence pressing in with weight that made breathing difficult. He stood at the window looking out over the city grid, lights marking millions of lives he'd never know. Somewhere in that grid was an apartment where a little girl probably slept under a borrowed tree while her mother coughed through another night. The distance between his window and that apartment was measurable in miles, but felt infinite in every way that mattered. His phone rang at 2 a.m., number he didn't recognize. Probably wrong connection or telemarketer with terrible timing. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Mr. DeMarco? The voice was female, young, uncertain. This is Jennifer from Little Angel's Daycare. I hope I'm not overstepping, but I found your card in Caitlin's emergency contacts. She listed you as someone to call if she couldn't be reached. I've been trying her cell for an hour, but she's not answering, and Cora is still here. We closed at 6. Caspian was already moving toward the door, keys grabbed from the entry table. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The drive through empty streets took 12, traffic lights blinking yellow at intersections abandoned by commerce and caution. The church parking lot held only one car, lights on in the basement windows where Jennifer waited with Cora, who'd fallen asleep on a mat surrounded by stuffed animals that weren't hers. Jennifer was maybe 20, college student probably working her way through education, guilt and relief competing in her expression as Caspian came down the stairs. I didn't know what else to do. It's happened before, Caitlin being late, but never this late. She always calls. Her phone is going straight to voicemail now. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to cause problems. She gestured helplessly at the sleeping child, aware that her decision tree branched into territories where good intentions created terrible outcomes. You did the right thing calling me. Caspian kept his voice low, not wanting to wake Cora yet. Do you have Caitlin's address? Jennifer nodded, pulling out a file with emergency information that included everything from allergies to custody documentation. Caspian photographed the address with his phone even though he already knew it, creating paper trail that would justify what came next. I'll take Cora home and make sure Caitlin is okay. If there's any problem, I'll call you. Jennifer looked uncertain, probably running through protocols about releasing children to people who weren't on official pickup lists. But it was 2 a.m., and she clearly wanted to go home, and Caspian was dressed in a way that suggested wealth and therefore legitimacy. She helped him gather Cora's things, jacket and backpack, and the drawing she'd made that day. Be careful driving. The roads are still icy. Her concern was genuine. Young woman who'd probably seen too much even in her limited time working with families at the edge. Cora barely woke when Caspian picked her up, small body limp with sleep, yellow hat askew. She mumbled something about her mom, then settled against his shoulder with trust that made his chest ache. He carried her up the stairs into cold that had gotten worse, secured her in his car's back seat with the blanket Jennifer had provided. The heater struggled against the temperature, fighting losing battle against Colorado winter at its worst. The drive to Riverside Apartments took longer than it should have, roads slick with ice that had formed after the day's brief thaw and evening's hard freeze. Caspian's mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. Caitlin collapsed somewhere unreachable. Caitlin in an emergency room alone. Caitlin dead in the apartment while Cora slept at daycare, waiting for pickup that would never come. The thoughts spiraled, horror building with each mile. Caspian carried Cora up the exterior stairs, her weight barely registering against adrenaline that sharpened every sense. The apartment door was unlocked, which sent alarm through his system like voltage. Caitlin was meticulous about security, had mentioned once in passing that locked doors were the only protection people like her had against a world that considered them targets. Finding it open meant something had gone very wrong. Emergency overriding habit and caution both. The apartment was dark except for the Christmas tree lights, still burning in early February like stubborn stars refusing to acknowledge winter's depth. Caitlin was on the bathroom floor, conscious but barely. Phone shattered on the tile beside her where it had fallen from her hand. Her breathing came in wet gasps that suggested fluid where only air should be, body folded around pain that radiated outward in waves. She looked up as light from the hallway spilled in, recognition slow to form in eyes glazed with suffering. Cora. The word came out mangled, half question, half prayer. Caspian set the child down on the couch, covering her with a throw blanket before returning to the bathroom. She's fine. I have her. Now let's get you up. Caitlin tried to protest, tried to insist she could manage, but her body betrayed the lies. Caspian lifted her with care, born from watching Isabella deteriorate, knowing where to support without causing additional pain, how to move someone whose bones felt too fragile for the weight they carried. He got her to the couch, positioned pillows behind her back to help breathing that sounded like drowning from the inside. Her medication bottles were on the kitchen counter, one empty that should have been refilled days ago. Insurance issues, probably, or pharmacy errors, or the simple mathematics of choosing between rent and prescriptions when both couldn't be paid. Caspian grabbed his phone, calling Dr. Chen with apologies for the hour that the doctor waved away with professional efficiency that didn't acknowledge time as relevant during emergencies. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen was administering treatments that required equipment he'd brought from his office, portable oxygen and medications that went directly into veins because her lungs couldn't process them fast enough orally. Caitlin submitted to the care with exhaustion that had moved past fighting, body recognizing it needed intervention pride couldn't provide. Cora slept through everything, small mercy in a night that held few. The crisis stabilized by 4 a.m. Caitlin's breathing returned to merely labored rather than actively failing. Dr. Chen packed his equipment with movements suggesting this wasn't his first middle-of-the-night emergency involving people who'd delayed care until almost too late. She needs hospitalization, proper monitoring, IV antibiotics. His voice was low, meant only for Caspian's ears. This is pneumonia on top of existing damage. Home treatment isn't adequate for what she's facing. Caitlin's eyes opened at the word hospitalization, panic overriding exhaustion. No hospitals. Please. I can't afford it. They'll keep me for days, maybe weeks. I'll lose my job. Who'll take care of Cora? The questions tumbled out between breaths that still came too hard, desperation making her voice sharp. I'll manage here. I always manage. The delusion would have been funny if it wasn't tragic. Woman insisting she could manage while literally dying on her couch. Caspian knelt beside her, positioning himself at eye level rather than looming. You almost died tonight while your daughter waited at daycare for pickup that wasn't coming. That's not managing. His tone was gentle, but uncompromising. Truth delivered without cushioning. Dr. Chen is right. You need real medical care, not just crisis intervention. Caitlin turned her face away, tears tracking down cheeks too pale against the pillow's fabric. I don't have choices. People like me don't get choices. The statement hung in the air. Indictment of systems that created false binaries between survival and treatment. Caspian had never faced that equation, never calculated whether living was worth the cost of medical bills that would follow him for decades. His family's wealth insulated him from decisions that destroyed people who'd committed no crime beyond being born into wrong economic brackets. The privilege sat heavy in his chest, uncomfortable acknowledgement of advantages he'd never earned but always enjoyed. What if those weren't your only options? The words came out before Caspian fully processed their implications. What if someone covered the hospital costs, the treatment, whatever you need to actually get better? Caitlin's eyes swung back to him, suspicion and hope warring in their depths. Nobody does that, not without wanting something in return. Her experience had taught her that help came with hooks, that generosity was prelude to demands that often cost more than the original problem. I'm not asking for anything except that you let yourself get proper treatment and focus on being healthy enough to raise your daughter. Caspian's voice was steady, despite the commitment he was making without fully understanding its scope. Consider it investment in a future where Cora doesn't grow up in the foster system because her mother was too proud to accept help. The argument was logical, removing emotion from transaction in a way that made acceptance easier for someone who'd learned to distrust sentiment. Caitlin was silent for a long moment, breathing slightly easier now that medication was working, mind clearly calculating angles and searching for traps. Why would you do this? We're nothing to you. Strangers who asked to borrow a tree and somehow became your responsibility. The question was valid, demanding justification for behavior that made no rational sense, given their non-existent relationship and vastly different circumstances. Because I can. Because your daughter drew me into a picture of a family I'm not part of, and somehow that mattered more than it should have. Because I've spent 3 years being too angry and sad to care about anything, and helping you is the first thing that's felt like it meant something since my wife died. The honesty surprised Caspian, as much as it clearly surprised Caitlin. Walls coming down in the exhaustion of 4 a.m. crisis management. Something shifted in Caitlin's expression, guard lowering fractionally. Okay, if you're really offering, I'll accept. But I want this documented, written down, so I know exactly what I'm agreeing to and what you expect in return. Her business sense persisted even through illness and fear, protective instinct that refused to leave her daughter vulnerable to arrangements that couldn't be verified or enforced. Caspian nodded, respecting the caution, even as it stung slightly, that she couldn't just trust his stated intentions. Dr. Chen made arrangements for a private facility that catered to patients requiring discretion, place where Caitlin would receive care without questions about insurance or payment methods. Caspian drafted a simple agreement on his phone's notepad, stating he would cover all medical expenses related to her treatment with no expectation of repayment or services rendered, document that would satisfy her need for clarity, if not completely eliminate her suspicion. She read it 3 times before nodding acceptance. The ambulance arrived at dawn, private service that operated outside normal emergency systems, transporting Caitlin to the facility where rooms looked like hotel suites and staff ratios allowed actual attention to individual patients. Cora woke as her mother was being loaded onto the gurney, confusion giving way to fear as she processed the scene. "Mama, where are they taking you?" Her voice was small, child's terror that parent was disappearing into systems that swallowed people and sometimes didn't return them. Caitlin reached out a hand that Cora grabbed with both of hers. "I'm going to get medicine that will make me better, sweetheart. Mr. DeMarco is going to take care of you while I'm gone." Her voice was steady despite obvious effort, mother prioritizing child's emotional state over her own distress. "You'll be such a good girl for him, won't you?" Cora nodded, tears streaming down her face, not understanding enough to be reassured, but understanding enough to be terrified. Caspian found himself promising things he had no idea how to deliver, assurances that Cora would be safe and cared for, and that her mother would come home healthy. The child transferred her grip from Caitlin's hand to his, small fingers digging into his palm with pressure that would leave marks. The gurney rolled out into morning that was just beginning to lighten, winter sun weak against cold that hadn't released its hold. Caspian stood in the doorway with a 5-year-old clinging to his hand and no idea what happened next. The apartment needed attention. Dishes in the sink and laundry piled in corners, evidence of someone who'd been too sick to maintain the meticulous order she clearly preferred. Caspian called his housekeeper, the woman who managed his penthouse, and asked no questions about his life, requesting she come to this address instead. Within 2 hours, the space was clean, refrigerator stocked, bills on the counter organized and addressed with checks from an account Caspian rarely used for anything, except charitable donations his accountant suggested for tax purposes. Cora watched the activity from the couch, still in her daycare clothes from the previous day, teddy bear clutched tight. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just observed with eyes that had learned too young that adults did inexplicable things that children had to accept. Caspian sat beside her once the housekeeper left, uncertain how to bridge the gap between his world and hers. "Are you hungry?" His question was practical, starting with basic needs, because emotional ones felt too complex to address without training he didn't possess. "Can we visit Mama?" Cora's response ignored his question entirely, focused on the only thing that actually mattered in her universe. Caspian nodded. "After breakfast. We'll get you cleaned up and fed, then we'll go see her. Deal?" Cora considered this, negotiations of a child who'd learned that adults rarely gave without requiring something first. "Deal. But I want pancakes, not cereal." Her specification suggested someone asserting what little control she had over circumstances that had spun beyond anyone's management. Caspian didn't know how to make pancakes, had never prepared food more complex than coffee or sandwiches. He called down to a restaurant that delivered, ordering pancakes and eggs and orange juice. Enough food for multiple children, even though only one small person needed feeding. Cora ate with mechanical efficiency, not tasting or enjoying, but fueling a body that needed energy for the stress of the day ahead. She didn't finish half of what he'd ordered, appetite suppressed by anxiety that flavored everything with ash. They drove to the facility in mid-morning traffic, Cora strapped into the back seat of a car that probably cost more than her mother would earn in 5 years of work. She didn't comment on the luxury, didn't marvel at leather seats or the sound system, just stared out the window at a city that looked different in daylight. The facility was in Cherry Creek, neighborhood where money lived quietly behind walls and gates that kept problems at a distance that allowed them to be ignored. Caitlin looked smaller in the hospital bed, IV lines running into arms marked with bruises from difficult insertion. She was sleeping when they arrived, breathing assisted by oxygen but no longer fighting for each inhale the way she had been hours earlier. Cora climbed onto the bed with careful precision, curling against her mother's side without jostling the medical equipment. Caitlin's eyes opened, focusing on her daughter with love that transcended exhaustion and fear both. The reunion was quiet. Few words because everything important existed in the physical contact of mother and daughter, confirming each other's continued existence. Caspian stood by the window, giving them space, watching Denver spread below in grids that organized chaos into manageable segments. The facility occupied the 10th floor of a building that catered to people who needed medical care without the indignity of standard hospital experiences. Privacy and comfort came at costs that most people couldn't conceptualize, let alone afford. A nurse came in to check vitals, marking numbers on charts with professional efficiency that suggested she'd seen every variation of family crisis humanity could generate. She smiled at Cora, complimented the teddy bear, asked if anyone needed anything with genuine warmth that money couldn't buy, but apparently didn't prevent. Medical staff here were paid enough to care without being destroyed by caring, luxury that underfunded public hospitals couldn't offer their workers who burned out treating endless streams of suffering with inadequate resources. Dr. Chen appeared mid-morning with lab results and treatment plans, speaking to Caitlin in terms that respected her intelligence while not requiring medical degree to understand. The pneumonia was responding to antibiotics, but the underlying respiratory disease needed more aggressive management. He'd consulted with a pulmonary specialist who'd reviewed imaging and recommended a treatment protocol that would take months to show results, but offered genuine hope for stabilization rather than continued decline. The specialist arrived after lunch, Dr. Patricia Wong, who'd trained at Johns Hopkins and published papers on occupational lung disease. She examined Caitlin with hands that communicated competence through touch, explaining that the damage was significant, but not yet irreversible, if they acted now with proper medication and elimination of all chemical exposures. Her prognosis was cautiously optimistic, predicated on Caitlin following strict protocols and never returning to the work that had destroyed her lungs in the first place. Which means I can't work at all. Caitlin's voice was flat, stating the obvious conclusion that everyone else was avoiding. Cleaning is what I know. Caregiving involves supplies that all smell like chemicals. I'm not qualified for anything else that pays enough to cover rent and daycare and food. The mathematics of her situation were brutal and inescapable, health requirements conflicting with economic necessities in ways that made recovery impossible without external intervention. Caspian had spent the morning on his phone handling business that couldn't be delayed, but his mind had been working through problems that weren't technically his responsibility, administrative work from home. He spoke from the window, turning to face the room. One of my property management companies needs someone to handle tenant communications, maintenance requests, invoice processing. It's all computer-based, can be done remotely, pays $45,000 annually with health insurance. The offer was real, position he'd confirmed existed during a call with his operations manager. Caitlin stared at him with expressions cycling through disbelief, suspicion, hope, and surrender. That's more than I've ever made. Why would you offer me a job that valuable? I have no experience, no relevant education, no reason you should trust I can even do it. Her questions were valid, poking at motivations that probably seemed suspect from her position of complete dependence. Nobody gave away opportunities like that without strings attached and invisible knots that tightened later. Because you're meticulous, organized, and good at managing impossible situations with inadequate resources. Those are exactly the skills required for dealing with tenants who always want more than they're entitled to, and contractors who always want to charge more than jobs are worth. Caspian kept his tone professional, removing personal elements that might make the offer seem based on pity, rather than legitimate assessment of capability. You'll have to learn the software and our procedures, but that's trainable. Work ethic isn't. The job offer solved practical problems, but didn't address the question Caitlin hadn't asked directly. Why are you doing all this? We're strangers. You don't owe us anything. Her voice carried exhaustion beyond the physical weariness of someone who'd spent years suspicious of kindness, because experience taught that generosity was usually prelude to exploitation. Rich men didn't rescue poor women without expecting something valuable in return. Currency that often wasn't clearly stated until debt had accumulated beyond ability to repay. Caspian moved from the window to the chair beside the bed, positioning himself where Cora couldn't hear clearly as she'd fallen asleep against her mother's side. My wife died 3 years ago, when she was 7 months pregnant. Medical complications that spiraled fast. He paused, rarely speaking these details aloud. She wanted to start a foundation, help families who couldn't afford the health care we took for granted. I was going to do it after she died, but I was too angry at the universe to help anyone. Maybe this is me finally starting what she wanted. The explanation was partial truth, easier than admitting he didn't fully understand his own motivations. Caitlin's expression softened, guard lowering slightly. I'm sorry for your loss. Losing her and your baby, that's unbearable. Her empathy was genuine despite her own crisis, capacity to acknowledge others' pain even while drowning in her own. Caspian nodded, not trusting himself to elaborate without exposing emotions he'd kept controlled through sheer force of will. Isabella had believed in redemptive possibilities of wealth used properly, convinced that money was tool rather than end goal. He'd dismissed it as idealism, but maybe she'd been right about obligations that came with privilege. Dr. Wong recommended minimum 2 weeks hospitalization to ensure pneumonia cleared completely and to establish baseline for long-term treatment. Caitlin's anxiety about the timeline was visible, calculations running behind her eyes about bills that would pile up, and jobs that would be lost, and logistics that had no easy solutions. Caspian promised to handle rent and utilities, to keep the apartment maintained, to ensure nothing collapsed while she focused on recovery. Each promise deepened the debt she was clearly tallying, burden that would eventually need reconciliation, even if he claimed otherwise. Cora woke in late afternoon, disoriented and frightened until she registered her mother's presence. They ordered dinner from the facility's kitchen, surprisingly good food that arrived on actual plates rather than disposable containers. Caspian ate mechanically, watching the dynamic between mother and daughter with something like envy. They had so little materially but such richness in their connection, bond that poverty couldn't diminish, and might have actually strengthened through shared struggle. His marriage had been loving, but they'd never faced hardship together, never tested their relationship against circumstances that demanded sacrifice. Evening visiting hours ended at 8. Policy enforced even in private facilities because rest mattered more than family comfort. Cora's departure was traumatic, small body rigid with fear that releasing her mother meant permanent loss. Caitlin soothed her with promises and reassurances, voice steady, despite tears tracking down her own cheeks. Caspian will take such good care of you, baby. You'll come back tomorrow and the next day until I'm all better and we can go home together. The words were optimistic, painting futures that might not materialize if treatment failed or complications arose. Caspian carried Cora to the car, her face pressed into his shoulder, soaking his shirt with tears and mucus. She cried the entire drive back to Riverside Apartments, grief that couldn't be reasoned with or comforted, only endured. He'd never felt more inadequate than in those 20 minutes, holding a child whose fear he couldn't fix, promising things he had no power to guarantee. The apartment was dark when they arrived, cleaned and organized but empty of the person who made it home rather than just shelter. Bedtime rituals were mystery to Caspian, who'd never been responsible for a child's care beyond theoretical future that died with Isabella. He followed Cora's instructions, running bathwater and finding pajamas, reading picture books with plots that made no sense but featured animals learning lessons about sharing. She fell asleep mid-story, exhaustion overwhelming fear temporarily. Caspian covered her with blankets, leaving the Christmas tree lights on, because darkness felt too absolute in an apartment that shouldn't need to accommodate 5-year-olds sleeping alone. He should have left, returned to his penthouse where everything made sense and nothing demanded emotional engagement. Instead, he stretched out on Caitlin's couch, too tall for the furniture, body complaining about positions it wasn't designed to maintain. The apartment was silent, except for Cora's occasional whimpers in her sleep, small sounds of distress that didn't wake her, but communicated ongoing processing of trauma her conscious mind couldn't handle. Caspian stared at ceiling tiles water-stained in the corner, evidence of leaks landlords hadn't properly fixed, and wondered what the hell he was doing. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant wondering where he was, from his cousin demanding explanation for missed family obligations, from his operations manager with questions about property deals pending signatures. Caspian ignored them all, unable to explain that he was currently lying on a couch in a near stranger's apartment playing temporary guardian to a child he'd met less than a month ago. The situation defied rational explanation, series of decisions that made sense individually but collectively added up to life disruption he hadn't planned or wanted. But here in the dark, with Christmas lights casting colors across walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing next door, Caspian felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Purpose. Not the empty satisfaction of business deals or the hollow performance of family obligations, but actual sense that his presence mattered to someone in ways that went beyond transaction or social expectation. It was terrifying and uncomfortable, and somehow the most real thing he'd felt since watching Isabella's coffin disappear into ground. Morning arrived with Cora standing beside the couch staring at him, teddy bear dangling from one hand. "Are we going to see Mama today?" Her voice was small, fragile with hope that could shatter if he gave the wrong answer. Caspian sat up, muscles protesting sleep on furniture never intended for adult men. Yes, after breakfast. The routine would provide structure, repetition that children needed when their worlds became unpredictable. They'd visit every day until Caitlin came home, and he'd figure out the rest as complications arose. The next 2 weeks fell into patterns that reshaped Caspian's existence in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Mornings started in the apartment with breakfast preparations that gradually improved from disasters to merely adequate. Cora taught him through patient demonstration how she liked her toast cut, which cereals were acceptable, why orange juice needed to be in the small cup, not the big one. The specificity of childhood requirements would have been funny if it wasn't so essential to maintaining stability in her disrupted world. Days were split between the facility where Caitlin slowly improved and his office where work piled up in ways that would have been crisis level if he'd cared more. His assistant adapted to his new schedule with professional efficiency, rearranging meetings and handling what could be handled remotely. His cousin stopped calling after Caspian finally answered once, and explained curtly that family business took lower priority than actual emergency. The shocked silence on the line suggested this represented radical departure from previous behavior patterns. Evenings back at the apartment involved dinner cobbled together from groceries his housekeeper had stocked, bath time negotiations, and stories read with increasing skill. Cora gradually relaxed into routine, tears becoming less frequent as her mother's improvement made promises of reunion credible. She started talking more, filling silence with observations about daycare drama and questions about why Caspian's car was so quiet and whether his house was really tall like her building but bigger. Her curiosity was normal child development reasserting itself as crisis receded into manageable anxiety. Nights, Caspian returned to his penthouse, space that felt even emptier after hours in the cramped apartment where every surface served multiple purposes and nothing was wasted. His expensive furniture was beautiful and useless, designed for aesthetic impact rather than actual living. The corner where his Christmas tree had stood 3 years ago seemed to mock him, absence that had become defining feature rather than temporary gap. He considered having furniture moved to fill it, but couldn't bring himself to erase the space Isabella had loved. Caitlin was discharged on March 4th with strict medication protocols and follow-up appointments scheduled through the end of the year. The ride home was quiet. Cora pressed against her mother's side in the back seat, both of them holding on with intensity that communicated how close they'd come to permanent separation. Caspian drove carefully through streets where snow was melting into slush, winter reluctantly releasing its grip as spring approached with typical Colorado unpredictability. The apartment smelled clean, evidence of his housekeeper's continued maintenance, but also empty of the lived-in quality that accumulated when people actually inhabited spaces. Caitlin moved through rooms touching surfaces like she was confirming their continued existence, her world exactly as she'd left it, except for evidence someone had paid all the bills stacked on the counter. She found the checks Caspian had written, amounts that covered February and March, rent plus utilities, generous interpretation of his promise to keep things maintained during her hospitalization. "We need to talk about all of this." Her voice was steady, stronger than it had been 2 weeks ago, but still carrying the fragility of someone whose body had betrayed her in fundamental ways. "I'm grateful, more grateful than I can express. But this can't continue like it has been. There has to be boundaries, clear understanding of what you expect, and what I can realistically provide." The speech had clearly been prepared, practiced during hospital nights when sleep wouldn't come. Necessary assertion of agency from someone who'd had control stripped away by circumstance. Caspian sat in the armchair that had become his spot during the past weeks, furniture that now felt familiar despite being secondhand. "I don't expect anything except that you take the job I offered if you want it, follow your treatment protocol, and let Cora grow up with her mother. Those are the boundaries." The simplicity seemed to frustrate rather than reassure her, rejecting the transactional framework she needed to feel like this was legitimate arrangement rather than extended charity she could never adequately repay. That's not how the world works. Caitlin sat on the couch with Cora beside her, daughter already falling asleep after the excitement and stress of homecoming. People don't do what you've done without wanting something in return. Maybe not now, maybe not explicitly stated, but eventually there's always a cost. Her cynicism was earned through experience, wisdom gained from living in a world where helping hands came with price tags hidden in fine print. She was trying to identify the trap before it closed around her, protective instinct that refused to be lulled by 2 weeks of seemingly genuine kindness. What if I told you I need this as much as you do? Caspian's voice was quiet, admission he hadn't planned to make. I've spent 3 years going through motions, performing life without living it. Helping you and Cora, it's the first thing that's made me feel like I'm actually here, instead of just existing in the spaces between work and sleep. The honesty felt dangerous, exposing need that didn't fit the narrative of wealthy man rescuing poor family from pure altruism. It reframed their dynamic into something more complex, mutual rescue that serves psychological needs on both sides. Caitlin studied him with expression that mixed skepticism and reluctant understanding. So this is therapy for you? We're your project to feel better about your wife dying? The accusation should have stung, but felt more like diagnosis, accurate assessment of motivations he'd been avoiding examining too closely. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know. I'm not good at analyzing my own psychology. But does it matter if we're both getting something necessary out of this arrangement? They sat in silence while Cora snored softly, small sounds of child feeling safe enough to truly rest. The Christmas tree still glowed in the corner, lights that should have been taken down months ago but persisted as symbol or stubbornness or hope. Caitlin finally nodded. Not agreement exactly, but acceptance that maybe some questions didn't need immediate answers. Okay, I'll take the job. I'll follow the treatment plan, and I'll try to accept help without calculating how to repay it. But I reserve the right to maintain boundaries if this starts feeling like something other than what you're claiming it is. Fair enough. Caspian stood, preparing to leave and give them space to reclaim their home without his presence complicating the atmosphere. I'll have HR send over the employment paperwork. You start when you're ready, probably another week or 2 to fully recover. Training is remote, self-paced, no pressure to perform before you're capable. The professional framing made the arrangement feel more legitimate, employment rather than disguised charity, transaction that allowed dignity on both sides, even if the terms were unusually generous. Caspian. Caitlin's voice stopped him at the door. Thank you for everything. I know I'm difficult about accepting help, but I do recognize what you've done. You probably saved my life, and definitely saved Cora from ending up in system that would have damaged her. Whatever your motivations, the impact is real, and I'm genuinely grateful. The formality of her statement suggested she'd been rehearsing it, necessary acknowledgement, even if her discomfort with owing debt remained unresolved. He nodded, not trusting himself to respond in ways that wouldn't expose emotions too complicated to name. The drive back to his penthouse should have felt like relief, return to familiar territory where he understood the rules and his role. Instead, it felt like abandonment, leaving behind something warm and real for expensive emptiness that asked nothing and gave nothing in return. His apartment waited with its perfect furniture and its dead corners, space designed for a family that would never fill it now that Isabella and their baby were 3 years gone. March transformed into April, with weather that couldn't decide between winter's remnants and spring's promises, snow one day and 70 degrees the next. Caitlin started work from the apartment, learning software and procedures with focus that suggested determination to prove she deserved the opportunity beyond pity. Her first week's communications with tenants showed exactly the competence Caspian had predicted, handling complaints with empathy while maintaining policies, finding solutions that satisfied without setting precedents the company couldn't sustain. His operations manager called to compliment the new hire's performance, unaware of any connection between Caspian and the woman who'd transformed their problem tenant file into managed relationships. Cora returned to daycare with stories about her mama being all better and the nice man who'd stayed with her and made terrible pancakes that got better over time. Jennifer, the young teacher, asked Caitlin about their arrangement during pickup one day, concern masked as curiosity about whether everything was safe and appropriate. Caitlin assured her that yes, it was complicated but legitimate, that Caspian had helped during crisis, without demanding anything inappropriate in return. The reassurance seemed to satisfy Jennifer's protective instincts, while probably not fully eliminating her concerns about power dynamics and wealthy men who attached themselves to struggling single mothers. Caspian visited the apartment once a week, ostensibly to check that everything was functioning properly, actually because he'd grown accustomed to their presence in his restructured life. The visits were casual, tea and conversation, while Cora played or drew pictures she insisted on gifting him. He'd accumulated a collection of crayon drawings that now occupied his office desk drawer, replacing the single thank you card with portfolio of stick figure families and houses with triangular roofs and suns with faces that smiled down on scenes of domestic tranquility. By late April, the Christmas tree was finally taken down, ornaments packed carefully away in boxes Caspian had brought from his building's storage. The corner where it had stood looked empty, absence more noticeable than presence had been. Caitlin apologized for keeping it up so long, explained that Cora had insisted, and she didn't have the heart to refuse after everything. Caspian understood, knew about holding on to symbols beyond their reasonable lifespan, because letting go felt like surrendering the magic they'd represented. He'd brought something else with him that day, small box wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Inside was the glass star ornament from his own tree 3 years ago, the one Isabella had loved for reasons she'd never fully articulated. "For our first little one," she'd said when she bought it, planning ahead to traditions they'd build together. Caspian had kept it in a drawer with other things he couldn't discard, but couldn't bear to look at, shrined to futures that never materialized. Now he held it out to Caitlin and Cora, offering what he couldn't use, but they might treasure. "This was my wife's, for the baby we were expecting when she died. I'd like you to have it, for when you put up a tree next Christmas." The admission cost something, required exposing vulnerability he usually kept protected behind walls money had helped construct. Caitlin took the ornament with hands that understood significance beyond monetary value, cradling glass that held someone else's broken dreams. "We'll take very good care of it, I promise." Her voice carried weight of understanding that this was trust as much as gift, permission to incorporate his loss into their traditions in ways that honored both past and future. Cora held the star up to the window, watching light refract through its facets into rainbow patterns across the walls. "It's beautiful, like real stars, but we can touch it." Her 5-year-old philosophy captured something essential about the exchange, turning distant cold beauty into something warm and accessible. Caspian felt something shift in his chest, ice that had formed around his heart 3 years ago, developing cracks that let warmth seep through in ways that hurt and healed simultaneously. May brought his mother's birthday, obligation that couldn't be avoided without creating family drama that would eventually demand resolution. Caspian attended the dinner at the family compound, performing his role adequately while feeling more disconnected than usual from the theatrical wealth and performed relationships. His cousin asked about his recent distraction, whether he was seeing someone, with tone suggesting romantic involvement, would be seen as either betrayal of Isabella's memory or welcome sign that he was finally moving on. Caspian deflected, unwilling to explain connections that didn't fit conventional frameworks his family would understand. He left early again, claiming morning meetings that were technically true, even if they weren't the real reason for his departure. The drive back into Denver felt like returning home, despite heading to a penthouse he'd never managed to feel like anything other than expensive hotel he lived in permanently. He found himself driving past Riverside apartments, slowing to see lights in the second-floor window where Caitlin and Cora were probably settling into evening routines he'd briefly been part of. The exclusion from their private world stung slightly, reminder that his involvement had limits defined by the nature of their arrangement. His phone buzzed with text from Caitlin, checking whether he was free for lunch the following day, because Cora had made something she insisted he needed to see immediately. The message was casual, friendly, without being overfamiliar, tone of someone who'd learned to navigate the complicated space between gratitude and genuine connection. Caspian confirmed availability, aware that his schedule had been gradually reorganizing itself around these interactions that technically weren't necessary for any business purpose. His assistant had stopped questioning the blocked calendar time, accepting that her boss's priorities had shifted in ways she didn't fully understand, but had learned to accommodate. Lunch the next day was at their apartment. Sandwiches and fruit that Cora had helped prepare with 5-year-old precision. That meant some things were slightly squashed, but made with enormous pride. The something she'd insisted he see was a drawing, more elaborate than her usual work, showing 3 figures holding hands under a tree with a glass star on top. The figures were labeled in careful letters someone had helped her spell: Mama, Cora, and Caspian. The inclusion of his name in her family portrait hit him harder than expected. Suggestion that she'd integrated him into her understanding of who belonged in her world. Caitlin watched his reaction with expression that mixed apology and question, clearly uncertain whether the inclusion would please or disturb him. She insisted you needed to be in this one because you're important to us. Her emphasis on the word important carried weight beyond simple description, acknowledging that he'd become more than rescuer or employer, had crossed into territory where his absence would register as loss. The statement invited response, needed confirmation that his own assessment aligned with the role Cora had assigned him. Caspian studied the drawing. 3 stick figures with circular heads and smiling faces, holding hands under a tree that would return next December with the glass star marking its top. The image was simple and profound. Child's vision of family that included him not as distant benefactor, but as integral member. He looked up at Caitlin, meeting her eyes with honesty that felt dangerous. I'd like that. To be important to you. Both of you. The admission crossed lines he'd been careful not to approach, shifting their dynamic from transactional arrangement into something personal that carried different risks and different possibilities. Something passed between them in that moment, understanding that acknowledged feelings neither had been willing to name explicitly. They weren't ready to call it love, weren't ready to define what their relationship was becoming, but they also couldn't pretend it was purely practical anymore. Caitlin nodded slowly, not agreement to anything specific, but recognition that they'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Okay. Let's see where this goes then. Her voice was cautious but not closed, leaving room for possibility, while maintaining enough guard to protect herself and her daughter if things developed in problematic directions. Summer approached with its promise of warmth and longer days, seasonal change that mirrored internal shifts happening in all 3 of their lives. Caspian had started keeping clothing at the apartment for mornings he stayed over on the couch after late evening visits. Caitlin's health had stabilized under proper treatment and reduced stress, her breathing easier and color better than it had been even before her pneumonia crisis. Cora was thriving in ways that suggested security and consistency were working their magic on a child who'd known too much uncertainty too early. They didn't call it love, they didn't call it family, but something beautiful had begun, something that didn't need a name, only time. Thank you all for following this story. If you've felt something along the way, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support matters deeply and helps us continue bringing stories like this to you. We'll see you in the next one.